Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. The political row over the British government's controversial welfare reforms is continuing. The government wants to overhaul social welfare payments, including introducing a £26,000 cap on the amount of benefits any household can receive. Its aim is to replace a series of separate benefits with the new universal credit, which the government says will be simpler to administer, fairer, and will encourage people into work. But its critics say the changes will badly hit larger families by including child benefit in the overall cap, hit the disabled by phasing out benefits like disability living allowance, and is being pursued for political rather than economic aims. The reforms have been at the heart of a game of political ping-pong between the Commons and Lords. MPs voted late on Wednesday to reject the latest amendments by the Lords, so the government looks set to get its way, though it has made some concessions. But how fair are these proposals? And are there other models of welfare the government should be looking at? To discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio in London by Dr. Richard Wellings from the Institute of Economic Affairs, Olly Parker from the Fabian Society, and Ian Greaves, who's the editor of Disability Rights UK. Richard Wellings, let me come to you first. Is what the government is proposing fair?
Not entirely fair. I mean, the benefits cap is a very crude measure and it will affect large families and people who live in expensive areas disproportionately. Having said that, though, the current system is also deeply unfair. It means that working families are often no better off than people who are out of work, so there does need to be change.
Olly Parker, is what's being proposed fair?
I wouldn't call it fair. I've seen various attempts to try and reform welfare over the years. I think all parties kind of agree that the current situation is not tenable. But I just think it's one of those where when the bill was published, it was kind of attached to quite a high ideal. But when the bill's published, people read it. Disability rights campaigners such as Ian, have read it. The Lords have read it. And, the devil's really in the detail. What seems like a very simple theory is actually very difficult to put into practice. What's underneath the bill that I think is unfair? I think the Labour Party, for example, have already said that they accept a benefit cap in principle. But it's the devil that's in the detail.
Well, let's come on to this issue of a benefit cap, because that is one of the most controversial aspects of the legislation being proposed. We'll come to you in a minute, Ian Greaves, to talk about specifically the impact on disabled people. But Richard Wellings, is this idea of a cap of £26,000 a year, in your view, a sensible and a workable and a fair idea?
I think overall it is fair. Obviously, it will affect a relatively small number of families in particular areas. But having said that, at the moment, you would have to earn something like £35,000 a year to receive an income net of taxes of £26,000. And the public in general find it deeply upsetting that many families on benefits are actually getting more money than they are when they're working hard. And the measure has got immense public support. So although it is a simple and crude policy, in political terms, I think it could be useful in terms of driving welfare reform forward, because it's really captured the imagination of the wider public.
But it's this issue of it being a rather crude measure to draw a fairly arbitrary financial line. A 26k has been chosen because it is essentially what the government says is the average salary of a working person in the UK. Really, how do you come up with a fairer system that doesn't sound quite so arbitrary?
Well, the problem is if you do come up with a fairer system, and it is possible, for example, with the housing to introduce a gradual phase out or something like that, a small percentage that would have a similar effect. But the problem with that is that people just don't understand it. The benefit system is so complicated that people don't know how much they're going to get if their circumstances change. At least a simple cap makes it very clear to people that they're not going to get any more money beyond a certain point. So it has its benefits. The simplicity has a lot of benefits.
Olly Parker, on the issue of a cap, is a cap of 26k reasonable?
It really depends where you live, isn't it? I think no reasonable person, if you went across the whole country, would say that a 26 cap is somehow unreasonable. But I think if you looked at sort of house prices in London, for example, you would see that actually that's a real struggle for people. I mean, Eric Pickles, who isn't known for kind of being on the left of the debate, shall we say, the government's communities and local government secretary, wrote to David Cameron and Ian Duncan Smith saying that this could make 20,000 families homeless. that's not an insignificant number. So I would suggest that you really, it's the detail of this bill that really needs to be looked at. As I say, the cap in principle, not too worried about, but the detail needs to be looked at.
And public opinion very much seems to be on the side of the government on this issue, though, wouldn't you say?
I don't deny that the cap is a popular policy, but there are other aspects of the policy. For example, there are some proposals in there which could decrease benefit payments to cancer patients. There's also proposals to charge for the Child Support Agency. I think these proposals actually be very unpopular with the public if you put it to them.
I'd like to come on to some of those points that you've raised in a moment, but Ian Greaves, let me just ask you first of all, there are quite a lot of aspects of this legislation that relate directly to disabled people, including changes to disability living allowance and so on. What are your concerns over the proposals as they currently stand?
Well, first of all, we have to accept that the system is very much in need of reform. Something like 1 in every 3 disabled people in this country are living in poverty. So we're certainly not happy with the system as it stands. However, the reform that we've got is regressive and will end up with far more disabled people living in poverty. In particular, with the abolition of disability living allowance and its replacement with a new benefit, personal independence payment, the government estimate that something like 500,000 people will be no longer entitled to the new benefit. And these are not people with relatively minor disabilities. These are people with very severe disabilities. Many of them will also end up losing employment and support allowance. As people move from receiving state support on with things like disability living allowance, these benefits open the door to other sorts of support available from local authorities. So we'll find that people are without any type of support whatsoever. So our concerns are that it's going to throw potentially hundreds of thousands of severely disabled people into poverty.
Do you accept that the current system as it stands has really seen a remarkable rise in the numbers of people who have been claiming things like disability living allowance, and in the economic climate in which we live, there is an argument to say that that's unsustainable in the long run?
There was a very substantial rise, but that was actually shortly after the benefit was introduced in 1992. That was when a significant increase from the older benefits, which were a mobility allowance and attendance allowance. And this was seen by the government at the time, which was John Major's Conservative government, as a success story. The increase in disability living allowance claims since then has been gradual and has been in line with the fact that we have an ageing population and more people consequently have disabling conditions. So there hasn't been a drastic increase over the last 10 years. As a society, we're still the 6th biggest economy on the planet, and I think we have a moral obligation to support those people who are most vulnerable.
Richard Wellings, on the question of the disabled, do you accept that this legislation is going to have a disproportionate negative impact on people who are disabled, some of them severely disabled, as Ian Greaves says?
Well, I think the severely disabled will continue to get benefits as they do today, and I'm sceptical that they will lose out. If you look at what happened in other countries that introduced welfare reform, like Australia and the States, then there wasn't any significant decrease in the numbers claiming disability benefits. In fact, in some cases, they actually increased. So whether the government will meet its targets is another question. But it's important to point out that a lot of the people getting disability living allowance aren't people who the average person will call disabled. So, for example, people who are alcoholics or drug addicts can get DLA. Also, a lot of the people have got sort of ambiguous conditions such as back pain, which are very difficult to prove either way, whether it's genuine or not. So there is a problem there. So clearly, it can't go on as it is at the moment, but it is going to create a lot of anxiety for people who are currently claiming, and I don't deny that.
People who are, you raised the issue of alcoholics and drug addicts, people who are suffering from either of those two issues, though, may not actually be able to work.
Yes, but they would also be entitled to basic benefits like income support or job seekers allowance and so on. So it's not clear to me why some of these people deserve a premium payment above anyone else who's out of work and on benefits.
Just a reminder, you're listening to Scott Craig on The Voice of Russia, and today I'm talking about the UK government's plans for welfare reform with my guests Richard Wellings, Olly Parker and Ian Greaves. Olly Parker, is the UK a country in which a culture of welfare dependency has cropped up?
I'd say absolutely not. I mean, if you compare us with other countries in Europe, I'd say absolutely not. I think it's a real sort of a myth that's sort of built up through the press, really. And I think some of the politics that get used around this issue are incredibly divisive. I think it's trying to turn one neighbour against another. Some call it dog whistle politics. I'm not too sure about that, but I do think it's a really divisive way of doing things.
You mentioned dog whistle politics there. I think you're alluding to the fact that the government, a Conservative-led government, is pursuing a ideological agenda rather than an evidence-based social agenda. Is that what you're implying?
You could say that. I mean, I'm not going to come here and sort of speak for the Labour Party or anything like that, but I think we can all see that, as Richard said, of course, that there is kind of simplicity in the political arguments that the government is making, which aren't necessarily supported by evidence.
Ian Greaves, I wanted to talk to you about some of the other benefits. You mentioned employment and sport allowance, which were also being phased out. What are your particular concerns with those?
I just wanted to clarify one point with disability living allowance, because I think there was a misunderstanding about that benefit. Disability living allowance is a benefit which is paid to people both in and out of work. It's not a benefit that it encourages dependency at all. In fact, quite the reverse. A lot of people find that with their disability living allowance payments, they're able to go to work. For instance, if they're getting a high rate of mobility, they're able to get a car from that and they're able to drive to work and back. So it's a benefit which gets rid of that isolation. Now, employment and sport allowance is the benefit paid to people who are not able to work. It is replacing the old incapacity benefit. It's partly a national insurance benefit, and the cuts to the national insurance elements of employment and sport allowance concern us greatly, because at the moment, as long as you continue to satisfy the criteria, you have a condition which limits your ability to work, you can get the benefit indefinitely. The government intend reducing this so that you can only get it for a period of 12 months. The only people exempt are people who are judged to have the most severe disabilities and people who are deemed as being terminally ill, which means that their life expectancy is limited to 6 months or less. So the large majority of people will only get this contributory benefit for a period of 12 months. Now, these are people who've paid into the schemes. These are people who would expect to have this benefit for as long as they have a condition that stops them from being able to work. There's been very little information out there on the media about this. People are going to be horrified when they find out that, having worked all their life, having paid thousands of pounds into national insurance contributions over the years, their benefit will be limited to 12 months, after which, if they have a working partner, they won't get anything at all. And we're talking about people with severe disabilities, somebody who's paraplegic, for instance, or somebody who's severely visually impaired would be unlikely to put into that small group of claimants who would be able to get the contributory element indefinitely. And that's just wrong.
You talk about the severely disabled and people who are terminally ill there. I don't think many would disagree with what you've said. However, there is a perception there are a sizable number of people claiming disability benefits who are not necessarily disabled. I mean, the sort of classic sort of stereotype of someone who hurts their back and is signed off of work and is then sort of put into onto disability benefits for a longer period of time. Or is that just a stereotype that really doesn't have any foundation in reality?
Well, if we're looking at disability living allowance, studies have showed that fraud of the system is something like 0.4%, so 1 in every 200 cases. Clearly, that's a problem.
Lords MPs voted late on Wednesday to reject the latest amendments by the Lords, so the government looks set to get its way, though it has made some concessions. But how fair are these proposals? And are there other models of welfare the government should be looking at? To discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio in London by Dr. Richard Wellings from the Institute of Economic Affairs, Olly Parker from the Fabian Society, and Ian will be simpler to administer, fairer, and will encourage people into work. But its critics say the changes will badly hit larger families by including child benefit in the overall cap, hit the disabled by phasing out benefits like disability living allowance, and is being pursued for political rather than economic aims. The reforms have been at the heart of a game of political ping-pong between the Commons and Lords. Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. The political row over the British government's controversial welfare reforms is continuing. The government wants to overhaul social welfare payments, including introducing a £26,000 cap on the amount of benefits any household can receive. Its aim is to replace a series of separate benefits with the new universal credit, which the government says will Greaves, who's the editor of Disability Rights UK. Richard Wellings, let me come to you first. Is what the government is proposing fair?
Not entirely fair. I mean, the benefits cap is a very crude measure and it will affect large families and people who live in expensive areas disproportionately. Having said that, though, the current system is also deeply unfair. It means that working families are often no better off than people who are out of work, so there does need to be change.
Olly Parker, is what's being proposed fair?
I wouldn't call it fair. I've seen various attempts to try and reform welfare over the years. I think all parties kind of agree that the current situation is not tenable. But I just think it's one of those where when the bill was published,